Good Sunday afternoon to everyone out there. This is Aaron Quilliams, your host for the Organic Theologians podcast. Hope everyone is having a good day. It's a beautiful day here in East Tennessee. Last time on Organic Theologians, I talked about the lack of biblical community in our modern churches today. I made the statement that the early church didn't separate church life from home life the way that we do in our churches today. And what I'd like to do in this podcast is define that statement a little more. So I'm going to be looking at some historical writings that are relevant to the formation of the community in the early church. One of the first writings will be the divinely inspired writing of the New Testament for the purpose of getting an overall perspective of the liturgy in the assembly of the early church. I'm going to look also at some historical non-canonical writings, some from modern scholarship, some from the early pre-Nicene church fathers, and one from Celsus, who was an antagonist of Christianity. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk for a minute about methodologies of biblical interpretation. And one of those methods is historical criticism. This is where, when one is studying a text, they analyze the historical and cultural context in which that text was written, so as to aid in the understanding of the author's original intent. One of the ways to find the cultural context of that which forms the background for a scriptural text is to look at other writings that are in the same time vicinity as the biblical text in question. One of the reasons I'm mentioning this is because I have found that when referencing non-canonical writings for the purpose of trying to understand a biblical text, sometimes people in the church, especially among what you might call conservative churches, seem to give little, if any, value to the use of non-canonical writings when trying to interpret Scripture. I think one of the reasons they do this is because of a certain view of inerrancy of Scripture. It's a view in which they over-spiritualize the Scripture, so much so to the point that it makes the indirect claim of removing the New Testament writings from the cultural context it was written in. But this we know is impossible, and I think people that hold this overly spiritualized view of inerrancy know that it is impossible too. But they feel in some sense that they are despiritualizing the Scripture, and understandably so in today's world. But one must remember, to go too far left or too far right is not to land in the perfect in-between place. Most of these conservative groups hold to a nearly exclusively traditional dogma interpretation of Scripture, or a spirit-only informed hermeneutic. And this varies from place to place. In some places you see an overlap between the two. Now, I agree with a spiritually informed hermeneutic, but I can't see how you can just rely on a tradition-only informed hermeneutic. That's actually a contradiction in terms, because a tradition is developed out of a hermeneutic. So people who do this they're not interpreting, they're just repeating what they've been told. But like I said, I agree with a spiritually informed hermeneutic, but not spirit-only. One of the problems with just relying on a spirit-only hermeneutic is that fallible humans are claiming to impart divinely derived interpretations of Scripture, which ends up being the canon or rule for the community of faith they are speaking to. Now, this is dangerous. We have had many cases in the last 2,000 years of Christianity of where many people have left the reservation of the Scripture because the voice inside their head said, "That's what God wanted me to do." I do agree that natural man can't get the spiritual undertows of the Scripture. But now, this is a complex area of understanding between the forming structure of the spiritual man and the natural man. It's something in akin to the struggle of the complexity, I think, of understanding the deity and the humanity of Jesus. But I do not want to get into that now. We need the Spirit to fully grasp Scripture, but the Spirit does not leave the reservation of the Scripture. And Scripture was not written to people in heaven. It was written to people who live in Ephesus, Nazareth, Corinth, and so on. in a language that they could understand. And it was usually applicable to the cultural situation they were living in. So this is why we need to apply an academically informed hermeneutic also. And that means looking at pieces of literature and archaeological findings that are connected to the time era of the text of the scripture one is seeking to understand. But now this is not a foolproof guarantee of getting the proper interpretation of scripture, because the issue is that the non-canonical historical writings were written by fallible men. How is one to know they are telling the truth? And the truth is we sometimes have little to no historical writings that pertain to certain problems we may run into when interpreting certain scriptures. This is where human endeavor hits a roadblock. Mind you, though, God created the human with its brain, but ever since the fall, man has lost the ability to ask his God for the answer when his God-given mental endeavor reached its limit. But thanks to the ability for the rise of man, accomplished through the cross and resurrection, man can be enlightened, and this is why we have to use the Spirit and our brain. In fact, these two are not separable. This is why I believe we must use a academically informed along with a spiritually informed hermeneutic. But this is no fail-proof method of proper biblical interpretation neither. The only way one's community is to know whether they have the proper interpretation is through the community of faith and its tangible manifestation of the Spirit's work within it. All right, that's my take on that, and that's where I'm coming from with this. Let's get into it. One of the things I'd like to do first is qualify my statement: the early church didn't separate home life from church life. That statement right there. I don't mean by this phrase that all the people in the early church lived in a communal type setting. Yes, it kind of looks like that in Acts chapter 2, but it never mentions in those passages that they all worked and slept in the same place. But we definitely see a push for a type of equality that did not forsake the poor. The communal settings of the early church were not a monolithical structure. It varied from place to place, being subject to the political and cultural setting it was in. There may have been times where bands of early Christians under the diaspora housed and lodged together, but in certain other areas that were not so much affected by the diaspora, you would have bands of believers who lived in single-family formations, meaning that these type of settings allowed for more private time between the biological family unit. So I'm not saying that the social atmosphere in the early church didn't allow for the ability to have privatized conversation outside the watchful eye of the community. But what I am saying is any private conversation that could or did lead to the fracturing of the community of faith was not seen as just a personal issue and thereby a non-issue for the community. The early church seen the deterioration of relationships in the private home and life as the deterioration of the church. And this makes sense, being Christianity is a sect of the Jewish faith, and we look at the Levitical law, in which its fulfillment is found then in the laws of Christianity. We see a serious focus on being your brother's keeper. You are to sound the alarm in the Levitical code if you've seen potentially damaging activities happening at your brother's home. This would be the mind of the early Christians. Yes, they had private time, but they understood the health of the church was directly linked to the spiritual health of the people in their everyday life outside the assembly, private or social. In our churches today, you can barely feel the freedom to ask about certain behaviors that members are portraying in the assembly, let alone outside the church meeting. To build on this more, let's look at some material from some modern scholarship. I just chose a couple of books that I had in my library. I'm only going to look at 2, but I have more on the shelf that say the same thing. So for the sake of not being repetitive, I'll just read these excerpts from these 2 books. The first book was written by a German theologian called Gerhard Lefink, and it's called Jesus and Community. And on page 99, He titles the section "The Praxis of Togetherness." And in this section, he quotes about 23 verses, and each verse contains what is called a reciprocal pronoun. But he says here on page 99, quote, "This section will take as its point of departure a different concept, or perhaps we should say a different linguistic clue, one which allows the reality of togetherness to be grasped rather accurately and perhaps even more forcefully than the concept of ecclesial communion. I refer to the reciprocal pronoun, one another. Consider the following list, which is far from exhaustive. Romans 12 and 10, outdo one another in showing honor. Romans 15 and 14, admonish one another. 1 Corinthians 12 and 25, have the same care for one another. Galatians 6 and 2, bear one another's burdens. 1 Thessalonians 5 and 13, be at peace with one another. 1 Peter 4 and 9, be hospitable to one another. 1 John 1 and 7, have fellowship with one another. Unquote. So you hear that reciprocal pronoun again. It's a one another is that reciprocal pronoun. And like I said, he has 23 of these verses, but I believe you get the picture that LaFink is trying to paint with these verses, with these few verses concerning the biblical mandate of practicing togetherness. And these are not reciprocal pronouns that were exclusively practiced during the assembly or in the privacy of the biological family unit. If the New Testament authors knew that we in the modern church practice these mandates mostly at church gatherings and rarely elsewhere, they would probably be bewildered at our ignorance of their understanding of community. And LaFink kind of hints at this on page 104, where he says, quote, much is wrong with our liturgies. They produce being next to one another, but not togetherness. And that our liturgies repress community is in turn only a sign that much is wrong with communication in our congregations outside the liturgy. Communication generally occurs only in reduced form. The content of the list with which this chapter began is frequently found in the private lives of Christians, but much less often in the level of Christian community. Now, the earliest Christian communities no doubt often fell short of the Pauline standard. The purpose of this book is certainly not to paint a romantic picture of the early church. Simply reading 1 Corinthians is an antidote for that. But it is not our guilt and our failure that are really dangerous. The real danger comes from the fact that we are no longer even aware that we fall short of what community and the people of God are, according to the New Testament, supposed to be. Unquote. In Episode 2 of this podcast, I echo what LaFink said in this passage. I spoke about that reduced form of communication in our assemblies being a hindrance to the building of proper relationships that produce proper community of faith. Let's go on. Let's look at this other book. It's called The New Testament and the People of God, written by N.T. Wright. He writes here on page 448 concerning the formation of the early church community. Quote, he says, the impetus to pool resources speaks of a community organization which resembles in some quite striking ways the discipline of the Essenes. The problems which arose in relation to the care of the needy, particularly widows, are most readily comprehensible if we envisage the church not as a part-time voluntary organization of the like-minded which left normal social and familial attachments unaffected, but as a group with definite boundaries. If one belonged to it, one did not belong anymore, certainly not in the same way to one's previous unit, whether familial or racial. The fact that contact with one's original family, race, and culture would most likely continue was taken for granted, but the way it was addressed proves the point. It was seen in terms of the way one copes with the anomalies thereby aroused, rather than in terms of a retreat to a less clear-cut demarcation. From baptism onwards, one's basic family consisted of one's fellow Christians, unquote. So, I don't think I've went too far afield in my claim that the early church didn't separate church life from home life when looking at these two scholars' take on what the formation of the early church's community's life consisted of. Like LaFink's call to attention Paul and other New Testament writers' mandates of the practice of togetherness, and his scolding review of how our modern liturgies hinder this, and Wright's historical analysis of the demarcation between one's original family and racial status to life in the family of the Messiah followers. I believe this supports my claim. The reason they didn't separate home life from church life the way we do today is because, as Wright said, when one came into the way of the Messiah's people, his basic family unit consisted of his fellow Christians. And a healthy family units don't hide or privatize their life from each other. They lean heavy on each other because the love that conceived them as a family, this love makes them see their brother or sister as just an extension of their very own existence. I believe this is Christ, the cross, and the goal to achieve in the communities of faith today. All right. Now, like most things, there's more than one side to the problem. So when we question, how did we come to compartmentalize our lives in the church the way we do today? That question has led me to discover a change that occurred in the early church's liturgies around the 4th century and really changed into the form that it is more familiar to us today during the Reformation. And what it is that has really helped this compartmentalizing is the rise of a group of people in the church that I heard Scott McKnight refer to in a lecture as soterians. And these people represent the mindset of a large portion of the church today. This is an ecclesia that spends most of its energy on being soteriologically focused. This is something that was not in the early church's liturgy. Their liturgy was mainly focused on the catechumates, the saints, and the Eucharist. So they were more focused on edifying the saints and teaching the recruits the way of the Messiah. They did not use the assembly as a platform for evangelization. To quote some church historians that are way smarter than me concerning the early church's mode in their assemblies, let's look at Justo Gonzalez's book, The Story of Christianity, Volume 1, page 115. And here he says, quote, "Although it is impossible to give exact statistics, the enormous numerical growth of the church in its first centuries is undeniable. This leads us to the question of what methods it used to achieve such growth. The answer may surprise some modern Christians, for the ancient church knew nothing of evangelist services or revival. On the contrary, in the early church, worship centered on communion and only baptized Christians were admitted to its celebration. Therefore, evangelism did not take place in church services, but rather, as Celsus said, in kitchens, shops, and markets. A few famous teachers such as Justin and Origen held debates in their schools, and thus won some converts among the intelligentsia. But the fact remains that most converts were made by anonymous Christians whose witnesses led others to their faith." Unquote. Also, in Donald Fairbank's church history book called The Global Church, The First 8 Centuries, in Chapter 4, he expounds upon the more informal liturgies of the first century church and then on the more formal liturgies of the second century church. But nowhere when explaining the mode of the services for these first 2 centuries of the church does he mention evangelization as playing any role in this service, but just echoes that of what I read of Justo Gonzalez. Now, this shift of the church being more soteriologically focused, where clergy focuses their services more towards the sinner than edifying the saints, and therein neglecting the saints. And now discipleship is not the only factor, but it is a big one, from which flows a lot of these other factors that have led to this compartmentalization of the lives of the people of the church. Let's look at some historical writings that add weight to these things I've just mentioned. Let's discuss the New Testament writings. Yes, even though it's divinely inspired, does not change the fact that it is also a historical writing. So when we look at the books of the New Testament, we see no place where it mentions the assembly being used as a platform for evangelism. What we do find is a call for unity and edification and right treatment between the Christians and the communities of faith, but nothing promoting evangelization in the assembly. There's only one place that implies this as a possibility, and that's in 1 Corinthians 14 and 23. And we'll look at that there in a minute, but I'd like to mention Celsus, whom Gonzalez quoted as a historical witness for helping understand how and where early Christians evangelized. Celsus wrote a critique of Christianity between 170 and 180. And even though there's no complete copy of the True Word, and that's what he wrote, it was called the True Word. We do have it, we think, fully preserved in Origen's apologetic work called Contra Celsum, which was wrote somewhere in the early to mid 3rd century. And if you read starting somewhere around the 49th chapter to the 55th in Contra Celsum, you will not just find where Celsus talks about the Christians doing their evangelization in the public arena, as Gonzalez mentions in his church history book, but you will also get a deeper feel for the ethos of the early Christians in the 2nd century, I think. Now let's look at 1 Corinthians 14, verse 23, and what it says. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speaks in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you are out of your minds? Now, where the ESV here in their translation uses the word outsider, can also be rendered inquirer or unlearned. But the Greek meaning that is translated unbeliever is just that. It's an unbeliever. Now, there is sometimes just a slight and sometimes unnoticeable difference between an unbeliever and a critical inquirer. And one of the commentaries I read on this struggled with that, but I don't think that's necessary. I think we need to just assume the unbeliever here is a straight-up unbeliever. And it is on the authority of this word unbeliever that some have justified the use of the assembly for a platform for evangelization. But I don't believe one can justify what has become the Western Church's mindset of primarily using the assembly for evangelization on this scripture. When studying the scripture, one must do like what we do when studying anything else. We must consider everything surrounding the subject, and when doing that with this scripture, the evidence does not support the use of this scripture as a directive for the use of evangelism in the assembly as a norm. So, Exhibit 1. Because of persecution in the early church, it was not common for Messiah believers to invite those critical of their faith to the home in which they were gathering because of the possibility of exposing the community to unnecessary persecution. And even though this may not have been a problem for the church in Corinth, as it was for the church in Jerusalem, there still is a problem of proper etiquette structure that may come into play here, like a stranger inviting theirself to a home that they have no acquaintances in. I believe this is why Alfred Plummer, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, says that this possibility of an unbeliever may be a friend of the family who may stop by out of curiosity. But it does seem odd for someone to just stop by unconnected to the house in a first century patriarchal culture. But given this, I know we must still hold out for the possibility that the church in Corinth was openly inviting unbelievers to their gatherings. And the homeowner was, were in agreement with this practice. Also, this being possible by a lack of any form of persecution. But this is hard to believe because of Exhibit 2, where when we look at writings like those of the pre-Nicene father Hippolytus, where in his writing called the Apostolic Tradition, written in the late 100s to the early 200s, he explains very clearly the tradition of the catechumate program And in doing so, he also explains the whole order of the service, which seems, according to him, to be focused by and large on those seeking to become members and the members themselves. There's no mention of evangelism playing a role in their gatherings. Also, keeping in mind, when looking at what is probably the oldest non-canonical writing on church formation, the Didache, some dating it in the 70s and some in the early 2nd century, it has what is called the teaching of the two ways in the beginning of it, which is believed to be the instructions that were to be given to the catechumates, and then the rest of the Didache is focused on such things like how to do the Eucharist. Again, it does not mention anything that would imply the use of evangelization in the assembly. This older writing, which, mind you, if you date it in the 70s, is just 20-some-odd years removed from the first letter to the Corinthians. But if you contrast it with Hippolytus' apostolic tradition, wherein he talks about the mode of the assembly, you can see a very close resemblance in the order of the early church's service. Yes, there is clearly a more formal evolution to the church's services about the 2nd century, but you can clearly see the familiarities from out of which these later formalities were drawn. But taking these two writings, the apostolic tradition by Hippolytus, the Didache, and then throw in Origen's Contra Celsum, where he records Celsus accusing the Christians of evangelizing in the public arena, it becomes hard to see much possibility for a claim of evangelization playing any part worth mentioning in the assembly of the early church. And this is just not my conclusion from looking at these non-canonical writings. This has been the general consensus of modern scholarship among church historians for quite some time now. So, now let's look at Exhibit 3 here. We want to look at verse 23 a little deeper for those who may find the claim that this unbeliever may be some friend of the family crashing in to see what's going on unconvincing. So for those who find that unconvincing, let's just look at the scripture itself and see if we can find ample precedence for assembly-based evangelization in it. The word "if" at the beginning of verse 23 is a translation of a Greek word that is a conditional participle / a conjunction. And this conditional participle in verse 23 is also followed by a verb that is in the aorist tense and the subjunctive mood. And that subjunctive verb in our English translation is rendered comes in. So where it says if one comes in, that word comes in, that's the verb, and it is a subjunctive verb. So verse 23 says, if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues and inquires or unbelievers comes in, this comes in is the verb of the subjunctive mood. And a verb that is in the subjunctive is a verb that deals with aspect. It is not like the indicative mood, which deals with factual. The subjunctive verb does not deal with time. Its significance is in aspect. It's as Bill Mounce says in his Basic of Biblical Greek Grammar book on page 289, quote, the subjunctive verb does not describe what is, but what may or might be. In other words, it is the mood not of reality, but of possibility or probability, unquote. That's why when we have this if at the beginning of the verse, denoting possibility of an unbeliever coming in, not when an unbeliever comes in, another verse with this same construct, having the conditional participle if and having the same subjunctive verb form, the only difference being its subjunctive verb is in the singular, is 1 John 2:1, where John says, if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father. What the hard part to derive is to what degree is this possibility with these subjunctive verbs in both these verses. This is where I believe we have to look at the other sources like the ones I previously mentioned, and we need the canon's total perspective on the particular subject under investigation. So, when I consider these three pieces of evidence that I just presented, along with the New Testament's overall perspective on evangelism, is why I can't justify using 1 Corinthians 14 and 23 as a proof text for justification of this ideology that one of the main functions of the assembly is evangelization. That is not just present in the clergy today, but also in the lay people. And like I said earlier, this is not the only contributor to the fragmentation of the community of faith in our world today, but it is a large one that needs to take priority in being broken down so that discipleship can start receiving the focus that is seriously lacking in our assemblies. And out of this, I believe, all the other issues will come to light. I know a lot of the things I've mentioned go against the church culture today, but for all that have been listening, I would encourage you not to let the church culture do your thinking for you. And I know this is easy because it really doesn't require nothing out of you but just to comply. But I really encourage you to investigate these things yourself, objectively as possible as you can. Don't fool yourself by going out on an investigation that is nothing more than you looking for evidence that supports your current worldview. Because when you're looking for just one kind of evidence, you're more inclined to just disregard other evidence. It's this kind of approach that has caused a lot of people that are looking at the church today and in the past to write off the church as a force that is to be taken seriously, as a well-functioning cognitive group of people. If you do a fair and just investigation, you'll find yourself entering into a conversation that will be participating in what I mentioned in a previous episode as active listening. And this listening is not just done person to person, but when reading a book, a magazine, or internet article. You try your best to turn off your internal dialogue and truly try to understand the other person. Well, I hope this helps and has made my last podcast, which was a few months ago, more clear. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the box below. Until next time, be careful out there.